guys. So I'm here with Kanv Garg from Ernst Young. Kanv works in Delhi, Ernst Young office, and he works with a team that is specifically focused on electric mobility in Ernst Young. He has worked on many projects with government, with other organizations, and has a wealth of information. He's here to share that information with us today. We are going to ask him some specific questions from more like a big picture point of view. So hi Kanv.
Hi.
Glad that you are here.
Thank you so much for having me.
We hear a lot of discussion on all fronts about what needs to happen, on policy fronts, on technology front, on companies putting out products, users doing their own research and changing their behaviors. What needs to happen? That's something we hear a lot of answers, and from specific points or specific focused on specific areas. We want to get a take from you on little more broader level. Just to begin a discussion, to kickstart a discussion, one thing immediately comes up in mind is catch-22. Should the electric vehicles come first or should the charging infrastructure come first? How do we start addressing this or any catch-22s like this?
Sure. Kedar, so the entire aspect of electric mobility and your large-scale shift in terms of how you fuel your road transportation, it's a big aspect. We cannot be having a kink or a break in the graph of this transition. So this has to be managed in a more holistic manner as far as possible. So though it has various angles to it, you have the energy security angle, you have the local manufacturing angle, you have the batteries manufacturing angle, then you have sustainability around environmental impacts of batteries, jobs, pollution, and renewables integration aspects to it. But just for the purpose of this discussion with you today, let me only focus on the catch-22 situation that you spoke about, which is what comes first, the charging infrastructure or the vehicle. Globally, this also has been a huge aspect of a debate. More or less, this has been solved. And this is what we've been seeing in India as well. It's the charging infrastructure which has to come first and not the vehicles. And this will of course lead to certain other issues around returns on investment and in terms of other aspects which we can talk about.
Right. So precisely, that's the first thing that comes to mind. Let's say if I am the person who wants to set up charging infrastructure, first thing is, where do I begin? And if I put in X amount of money right now, at what point I will get my return on my investment? What point I will get enough customers to make me feel that this was the right business direction?
So first things first, suppose if we all agree that yes, the charging infrastructure needs to come first, then the question comes in the private entrepreneur's mind, how and where do I set up the charging infrastructure?
Correct.
In our studies, in our experience of working with global and domestic clients, what we have figured out, and I'm giving you an output here, is that setting up a charging infrastructure is not a financing or a technology problem. It's predominantly a real estate problem.
I see.
How does the public sector or the private sector player get available and accessible land to set up charging infrastructure? This might be a bit easier for the government, but this is a bigger challenge for the private sector to solve, which can be solved with the regulatory infrastructure being provided by the public sector. I give you an example. If I want to set up a charging infrastructure for public use, and of course we can talk about the business model and the returns on investment there, my basic issue is, how do I get access to available or publicly accessible land? The land titles need to be clear. There has to be safety aspects considered. There has to be a power line flowing into that piece of land. So that's a bigger problem. And we have seen time and again, though we are the 7th largest country in the world, on various kinds of development, including large-scale solar and rooftop solar, land has been the pertinent issue. It's not the technology. It's not the regulatory infrastructure,
Okay.
but it's actually land which has been the issue. Hence, now where do we start? So that is why where we have to see this entire electric vehicle charging infrastructure business in a more holistic manner at a city level, where your urban, transport, power sector and your oil and gas sector come together to make available or assess all the possible kinds of real estate available for setting up of charging infrastructure. And we can talk about it in detail as well.
All right. That sounds pretty interesting. Again, coming back to an entrepreneur who is thinking about setting up a charging infrastructure or charging infrastructure business. If I have a location in mind, or what would be my first step, and what is the support system available for me to take those very early decisions in especially the location part of this whole map.
Sure. So let's try to remove the noise from the system.
Okay.
In terms of regulatory procedures, in our grid code, supply code, safety codes, all the possible requisite regulations are more or less available.
Okay.
If I want to set up a charging infrastructure under the utilities ambit, I can do anything of that. Number two, so once the regulatory noise is out of the system, then it comes down to the question of what kind of land is available, who is owning that land already, what kind of a revenue sharing or a business model do I need to get into it.
Right.
And the other bigger aspect is what is the kind of footfall of electric vehicles that I will see on that charging infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Publicly available charging infrastructure. Is it electric rickshaws? Is it some one-time charging of two-wheelers, or of the fleets, or of some other last-mile connectivity vehicles? So that is why at a city level, a cohesive transport planning as well as urban sector infrastructure mapping needs to be done, and some kind of a transposing needs to be done to define the electric vehicle charging strategy at a city level. And every city, basis on its geographical span and the kind of movements, electric vehicle movements possibly happening there, will be different from each other. But what can be done at a city level is that for the city commissioners or for the urban department or for the transport or the power department, at least templates can be built where they can start thinking about this entire issue in a more cohesive manner.
Thanks, Kan. So coming back to this city level intervention, what do you think needs to be done and who should start doing it?
Sure. So Kedar, based on our work that we've done for the central government, a few state governments and for some of the private sector clients, a few recommendations that come out of our mind are as follows. That at a state level, number one, there needs to be a holistic electric mobility transition plan developed. When I say a holistic plan, what I mean is that the city level commissioner needs to have the relevant stakeholders from urban, transport, power and the oil and gas department sitting together and figuring out the available real estate which can be used for setting up charging infrastructure. That's number one. Number two, very simple thing but extremely pertinent for this disruption, facilitating collaborations. There might be one department which has the land and the other department which might be giving you demand for that land for charging infrastructure. There has to be a facilitative cross-sectoral, cross-functional environment where these collaborations can happen on real estate. Thirdly, we talk about low footfall of electric vehicles. Hence, a more holistic planning around the urban transport movement needs to be done. Transport assessment mapped by GIS mapping of power infrastructure and urban land, and all of them transposed over each other, and then analysis being drawn on a GIS software could be one of the ways forward to do a city level planning. Fourth, when we talk about the low footfall and the low returns because of that low footfall on the charging infrastructure for the next few years, because quote unquote we don't have the right models plying in the market right now, the government can look at setting up charging infrastructure to bridge that transitionary gap. For this, again, first 3 points remain valid, but for the public sector department themselves, and they can look at setting up charging infrastructure. There are a few use cases around that. For example, BESCOM, Bangalore Electricity Supply Company, they want to set up around 70 to 80 charging stations within the Bangalore metropolitan zone to kickstart this market. There are several other cities like Pune. You have the Lighthouse program in Pune where they are looking at charging infrastructure planning. Calcutta, CESC is looking at setting up charging infrastructure. So there are use cases. However, in our experience at a state level, yes, there is a lot of scope where your city administrators need a more structured and a templatized approach on how to think about this holistic problem solving around charging infrastructure. And this, in our opinion, could be the one makeshift change which can enable a transition towards electric mobility. Gives you a policy clarity and a demand clarity for electric mobility transition to happen at a city level.
Based on what you just mentioned, I want to ask something. So when we come to government is trying to play a role of catalyst, and they have certain funds, and then they're trying to use their funds to have a maximum impact or get this electric mobility maximum traction. The most common line of thinking is use these funds to maybe give out some subsidies and kickstart the whole thing.
Sure.
Based on what we just discussed, do you think there is a better way? What is the most efficient way to use these funds to kickstart this mobility?
Sure. Kedar, so that's a great question and a very, very pertinent one, because in India we have limited public funds. There are several competing uses for every dollar available. So while we want to spend money on subsidies on electric mobility because it leads to a transitional shift towards energy, manufacturing, transportation, there are other competing uses in other softer sectors: healthcare, sanitation, water, education, and many more. So based on our prior experience and where we see the market moving, there are smarter ways to crowd in private sector capital by using your limited public funds. What I'm trying to say that for every dollar of public funds spent, you can have a bigger bang for that buck. An example of that could be, rather than doling out inconsequential or unlimited subsidies towards the vehicles, the similar public funds can be used for this city level planning. That will, number one, give policy clarity. Number two, put in the private sector's mind the seriousness of the government to transition towards electric mobility. And because of the preparatory work done, give more impetus for electric vehicles and further charging infrastructure to be built up. So this is one way.
Okay.
The other way, what we also feel is that you spend the limited public funds in kind of capacity building of the state governments. While we can talk about an armchair kind of guidance sitting in our offices, we all know that on all these conflicting sectors, power, urban, transport, the capacity is so much limited at a state level. You need to capacitate, you need to educate, you need to build awareness programs around electric mobility. Awareness, for example, if you really ask me, is one single biggest issue which is coming in towards a sustainable transition towards electric mobility. Way number three could be that while we are talking about the city level planning, capacity building, awareness creation programs, certain aspects of electric vehicles or the entire mobility value chain will require capital subsidies as well.
Okay.
For example, some kind of capital subsidies for your running public buses on an operational cost basis with the STUs could be one. Giving subsidies for the batteries rather than the entire vehicle could be another way to bring down the cost or the upfront cost of the electric vehicles. Two-wheelers, which are supposed to be the one kind of electric vehicles that can make a shift from normal vehicles to electric vehicles. Two-wheelers might be subsidized for certain number of years. Or it could be that when we talk about electric vehicles being available outside the country and they are not plying inside the country because of high import taxes, at least for the OEMs who have invested in line with the government's line of thought on their ICE platforms, we could look at subsidizing or removing the import tax on their electric vehicle variants for a few years' time while they can build their local supply chains in India. So our only point remains is that yes, capital subsidies are important, but they are not the only way to transition electric mobility sustainably. There are other softer aspects that need and that should be addressed in the electric mobility value chain to enable this transition.
Thanks, Kanv. That was a very interesting, very useful information. It was great talking to you on this subject, and great. We really appreciate your insights. Looks like your team is doing fantastic work. Our users are very knowledgeable, and many of our users are actively involved in this area.
Thank you, Kedar. Thanks for having me. So it's been a pleasure to watch the PluginIndia videos, and I think they are very knowledgeable. They give you a capsule-sized knowledge on whatever you want. So I'm very glad to be here. I represent EY, Ernst Young. I'm a director with the Electric Mobility and Renewables team. And you can imagine by the very title that how much interest this space is garnering, that we have had a dedicated team which is only working on electric mobility at EY. And we've been helping several state governments, central government and private sector players on this entire transition to this disruption on electric mobility.
Fantastic. If anyone has any more questions in this area, is it possible for you to share your contact details with us?
Sure. So the team is always available to work with all the interested people in the space.
Okay.
And basically, collaboration, if we are preaching collaboration,
right,
we are also practicing collaboration. So we are happy to collaborate in any manner that takes the sector forward.
Okay.
I'll be happy to leave my contact details and would be extremely delighted to answer any of your questions.
Thank you so much.